Hello and welcome back to New Future. In this channel we talk about everything investing and we go into the details so that you can understand better what's involved with investing, no matter what kind of investing. And I say this for a reason. Until this date I've been talking about investing in the stock market. But now we're going to change things up and talk about investing in property. And more specifically investing in property in where I live, Melbourne. And property is one of those things where everyone feels like they're an expert, although most people actually aren't. Now before we begin, I just have to say that this is for entertainment purpose only. Always get professional advice before you make any financial decisions. And in this video, we're going to talk about the formula you need to follow, things you need to consider before you actually start finding an area to buy in. Buying in the right area is very important. There's a lot to learn, so we're going to get into it. Hopefully you stick with me. If you get confused at any stage, just leave a little comment in the video and I'll try my best to reply to it as soon as I can. And before I begin, I just want to tell you a story. A few years ago, a friend of mine came up to me and said, I want to start investing. And I've spoken to my family and they reckon the real up-and-coming area, the area you want to buy in, is Berwick. Now, if you don't understand Melbourne very well, let's put in Berwick and we can see whereabouts it is. So here it is. This is Berwick here, being marked out as we can see. It's near Narre Warren here. It's near Cranbourne, which is down here a bit further. We've got Clyde. We've got Beaconsfield. It's right here on the edge of the city. And if we scroll out, we can see Melbourne, the centre of Melbourne, is all the way up over here. I just wanted to leave you with what I was told, and at the end I'll tell them what my thoughts were. So just before we begin, I just want to go through what makes property value go up over time. And at its very basics, it's quite simple. It is a desirable location, but that also has to go hand in hand with scarcity. So you can't have one without the other. You can have a desirable location, but if there's so much land, that land's not going to go up over time. Or you could have scarcity, but if no one wants to live there, then that also, the price isn't going to go up over time. But you'll find that that is very rare. If it's an area with scarcity, that will mean by default that that is a desirable location and people want to live there. Let's start talking about Melbourne itself. So Melbourne, as we can see, is very large. It uses up quite a large area. We can see down here it goes from Werribee all the way around, all the way down to here, which I would say, personally, I would say it ends around Frankston here. You will hear some people like to include the Mornington Peninsula, which is where I'm located. Some people would like to say that this is the city, but personally I think it's far from it. Because you're looking at Portsea. If you wanted to go from Portsea to Melbourne, you're looking at about a 2-hour drive. To include that as part of the city is, I think, a little bit far-fetched. So it's quite large, as we can see, and it's sprawling and it's spreading out. And quite recently the government put a stop to that and said we're not going to build any more houses past a certain point, which is a good thing, I think. The more we allow it to spread out, the worse it'll become. It'll become like LA, where it just is out of control and it is just too wide and vast. And that has a lot of issues. So Melbourne's been around for hundreds of years. Most people would live closer in, around here, the central region of Melbourne. And all of this here was farmland. When the baby boomer generation came out, we saw this trend of moving further out where you can get cheaper land, larger houses, bigger space at a better price. And so we saw a lot of the baby boomers moving out. So we saw a lot of people spreading all the way out in every direction for their little quarter acre, their space where they can raise a family, that whole idyllic idea. But then what we've seen with the new generations that come in was a reversal of this. All of a sudden, everyone wanted to start moving back into the city region. And what that meant is that all of these developers said, right, we know what we want. Everyone wants to live in the city, close to all the amenities, close to work. Everyone wants to live in the city. So we started seeing one thing, apartment buildings, large apartment buildings, all getting built up all the way around the city. So let's go back to my point that I mentioned earlier. So all these developers found an area. They said, right, this is desirable. But what happens as soon as you start building a lot of apartments? The second part of this factor falls apart, the scarcity. You've suddenly built all of these apartments. There is no longer scarcity. So that means you've got empty apartment buildings all throughout the CBD. And now this is a real crisis, especially since they built all of these apartments to sell to internationals, which for many of them was just a way of parking their money. They're sitting all this money, they go and buy foreign apartments in other countries just to hold their money. Most of them don't actually live in them. They just put their money there and the building stays empty. But what happened is the government actually tightened those rules a few years ago, and it's not so easy for all of these internationals to buy these properties. And so now we've seen all these developers who actually can't find anyone to buy these apartments. So looking at our formula again, we don't have that scarcity in the CBD. Yes, some people would like to live here, but it falls apart on the scarcity. If we zoom out a little bit further, we've got other regions like Richmond, Fitzroy. These areas have both the scarcity, there's no more land, we can't build up, we've got restrictions on building really tall buildings in these areas, and there's more desirable, there's more things, the desirability aspect, we've got all the cafes, we've got the ease of transport, we've got all of these factors helping these regions. These are the regions where you want to live, where this equation actually makes sense. And what we find is the real up-and-coming areas, which aren't necessarily the areas I was showing, like Richmond, is that over time it does spread out as we go. And so for most up-and-coming people, we find themselves looking further down. Maybe Parkdale, Mordialloc, Blackrock, Aspendale, probably all the way to maybe Chelsea. But you can see the regions that I'm mentioning here are Bayside, so that's a big push. And so going back to our formula, regions that have these points, that tick these boxes, both of those points, scarcity and desirability, that desirability lends itself to Bayside, near the water. That's a big push for a lot of people. Let's move all the way back down to Berwick. And as we can see, Berwick over here is actually not really anywhere near the water. So we've got desirability. Yeah, 100%. This could be desirable for many people. It's near open, farmland, which is really nice. But let's look at one other thing. Let's go to realestate.com.au and look at listings here, and we can see, there is 1,452 results. That's not really doing a lot, is it, for our scarcity? When people say up and coming, you need to understand what they actually mean. Does it mean people are just moving into that area? Well, possibly. And that brings us to another point, just to confuse you even more. This next point we need to understand is the kinds of people moving into that area. So you want to buy a region where the money is, and so there's going to be more of a push towards the higher prices and the increase in price over time. The people who live in the city are usually your white collar, your office workers, your bank managers. The people with the higher jobs will tend to live and work in the city. The further we move out to the blue collar jobs, if you do your research, the people who tend to live in these regions tend to work in these regions. Yes, there are some people who do travel into the city every day to work. I used to do it a few years ago. However, if you look at the stats, we're talking about our blue-collar workers. We're talking about the local businesses, the people who live and work in those areas. And what this effectively means is these are more everyday people with less disposable income. And what you find is the people who live in these areas tend to work in the city, and they want to have that lifestyle and are willing to spend more money for that proximity to the city without actually living in the city. And we need to understand we're looking this at a purely investing point. As I said, I live in the holiday region of Mornington Peninsula, where people come here every weekend for a holiday. That is the lifestyle I like, but it's not the kind of area that I would invest in necessarily unless you're looking at short-term rentals and holiday letting, things like that. But if we're looking at more of a investing to rent out and see your price go up over time and getting the best dollar in terms of rental income, you want to look at those areas that do actually fall into this category. Now let's preface this by saying over time 100% these are going to go up in time, but we need to decide what rate that's going to go up. Those inner suburbs, as I mentioned before, those regions will go up a lot faster than Berwick does. And it's important to realise that is there scarcity around here? Well, okay, so people can move down to Pakenham. And all of this can be property. And that's the problem. Pakenham is really spreading out with more property, and if there is no cap on the amount of properties available, the amount of land available, you won't see a large increase in price. As opposed to down here where we see there's no available land. It is all taken up. That is why we see this larger increase over time, because there is simply no more land available to build those properties. Up and coming doesn't necessarily mean a great area to buy. And yes, there's gentrification which plays a part, but I think I'll do a whole nother video on gentrification and what this actually means, because it's actually a really important aspect to understand. But in this video, we want to stick with this formula, and so whenever you start looking at your own properties, make sure you're looking at the areas that do actually tick this equation. This equation is really the fundamentals of buying property. Stay true to this formula as best you can. Try not to go with where it's just cheap, because it doesn't necessarily mean the best return for your money. Don't think about where you'd like to live, because that's going to be different. You'll find that most budding investors, those who buy their first property, will tend to look within a 5-minute distance from where they live. And that's the wrong way of thinking. You want to look at this formula and make sure you follow this formula as close as you can and keeping true to these points. But with that said, hopefully this makes sense. If you've got any questions, leave it in the comments. Thanks for watching. Make sure you like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. See you later.